Imagine that you have devoted 30 years of your life to creating something from scratch, and then your own daughter-in-law stands in front of a packed meeting room and fires you with a smile. She thought she had humiliated me, wiped me off the face of the earth, and even convinced others that I was a thief. But she didn't know that I still had one thing she didn't have: patience. And that patience will expose all the lies she so carefully hid. Stock up on drinks and snacks. Bon appetit, I'm starting. For 3 decades I poured myself into our family's art gallery and restoration shop. 30 years of cataloging collections, mending cracked varnish like a field medic with a gentler touch, and coaxing color back into canvases that had gone dull as last week's coffee. I could tell you which upstairs window stuck when it rained and which dehumidifier rattled like a nervous tambourine. I trained interns who now speak in panel discussions like they invented linseed oil, and I have the wrist scars from 1,000 frame fittings to prove I lived this life. I wasn't just on payroll. I was the patina, the quiet glow that takes time to build. Or so I believed. Then came Clara. My son Daniel, sweet boy with a salesman's smile and a collector's heart. Met her at some fancy symposium in New York where everybody wears black and pretends they aren't eyeing the canapes. She called herself a cultural consultant, which to my ear sounded like cashmere for professional whirlwind. She could drop 3 museum names into one sentence without musing her lipstick, and she shook hands like she was sealing a treaty. I set extra places at Sunday dinner, I asked her about her projects, and I tried to keep up with her theories about disrupting legacy institutions, which is a mighty polite way to say tossing grandma's recipe to make room for boxed mix. I did my best. Still, something about her felt rehearsed, as if I were watching a dress rehearsal and waiting for the real person to arrive. 3 years marched by in a blur of openings, donor brunches, and more acrylic pedestals than a sane woman should dust. On a Tuesday that smelled like lemon cleaner and worry, I straightened my jacket and walked into what I'd been told was a routine board presentation. The projector hummed, the water glasses sweated little rings onto legal pads, and I took my usual chair, the one where the air vents sighs like an old dog. Folks nodded at me, some tight smiles, some grateful ones. I had my notes, conservation updates, upcoming exhibitions, the kind of lists that keep a place honest. Clara stood at the head of the table in a navy suit sharp enough to slice bread. She didn't shuffle papers or clear her throat. She looked around like a conductor about to raise her baton. "We need to address a barrier to progress," she said, and there it was, that polished microphone voice she uses when photographers are lurking. A hush fell that I could feel in my knees. She clicked to a slide that should have been our new exhibition schedule. Instead, it was a bullet list about modernization and strategic pivots. I braced for a lecture on QR codes. "Evelyn," she said, using my name like a gavel, "your outdated perspective is holding the gallery back." Well, I have been called many things: meticulous, particular, chronically early, but barrier to progress was a fresh label to pin to my cardigan. I glanced around the table. One trustee pretended to review the agenda so hard his paper crinkled like a candy wrapper. Another stirred her water with a pen, which is not how anyone drinks. Daniel wasn't there. He'd been traveling, something about wooing a collector in Chicago. My heart did a little hiccup at that, then settled. Clara went on, voice smooth as museum glass. "Effective immediately, we're restructuring leadership. Thank you for your years of service, Evelyn, but the gallery needs a new direction." She didn't say the word, but it landed just the same, fired. 30 years, condensed to a sentence that didn't even wrinkle her suit. Now I am a woman who has seen frames fall and tempers flare. I've rescued canvases from basements and egos from themselves. So I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I felt the heat crawl up my neck and settle in my ears like 2 embarrassed cherries, and I thought, well, isn't this a pickle? I folded my hands, palms still smelling of beeswax from the morning's gilding touch-up, and I took a breath long enough to count the ceiling tiles. "I see," I said, and it surprised me that my voice came out steady, like it had found a banister to hold. "In that case," I stood, "slow as you please, because rushing only makes a scene, and heaven knows we already had one." I straightened my notes even though they weren't invited anymore. Then I gave Clara the kind of smile a grandmother gives when she knows where the extra cookies are hidden and the children don't. "Good luck, you'll need it." A single pen rolled off someone's legal pad and clinked on the floor. Bless that little pen. It spoke for the room. Clara's expression didn't crack, not quite, but I caught a flicker behind her eyes like a hallway light that thinks about going out. I tucked that flicker into my pocket the way I tuck spare buttons into old Altoids tins. I didn't know what it would be good for yet, only that it would. And as I turned toward the door, spine straight, heart careful, I felt something inside me shift, like a painting settling true in its frame after you let go. I went back to my office, though calling it just an office always felt a little insulting. That space had been more like a second living room for the past 30 years. The walls smelled faintly of varnish and strong coffee, the two scents that had carried me through countless late nights before exhibition deadlines. My chair was molded perfectly to the shape of me. The carpet had a worn trail from the door to my desk where my shoes had marched back and forth for decades, and the old filing cabinet rattled in protest every time I opened it like it was muttering, "Haven't you pulled enough out of me already?" I stood in the doorway for a minute, taking it all in, and then I spotted the cardboard box in the corner. The same box I'd always meant to use for donations. Well, wasn't that fitting? Instead of extra coats or books, it was about to carry the scraps of a career. First thing I placed in it was my chipped ceramic teacup, the one I'd made in pottery class on a whim 10 years ago. The glaze hadn't taken evenly, and it looked a little lopsided, but it held coffee like a champion. Every intern who ever came through the gallery had heard me say, "Don't touch that cup, it's charmed." Into the box it went. Next was the stubborn little bonsai that I'd somehow managed to keep alive despite my black thumb. It sat on the corner of my desk like a silent coworker, curling its leaves no matter what I did. I swear that tree had survived more gallery drama than most staff members. I cradled it gently before setting it down in the box. Then I took down the framed photo from the summer fundraiser a few years back. Someone had caught me mid-joke, and half the room behind me was laughing with open mouths and crinkled eyes. It wasn't a perfect picture. My hair was doing something odd in the humidity, but it captured joy. That went on top. The rest was practical. Pens that never rolled properly, a notebook filled with half-finished to-do lists, the award plaque from the Cultural Preservation Society that had my name etched in neat little letters. Each item seemed smaller the moment I placed it in the box, as if Clara's words had physically shrunk everything I'd accomplished. By the time I walked back out with that box in my arms, the atmosphere in the gallery had shifted. People had stopped pretending to type or shuffle papers. They were watching me. Sophie from accounting had tears running down her cheeks. Victor from curation looked like he wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. A few folks gave me tiny nods, like they were saluting me in the only safe way they could. I kept my chin up, walking slowly past them all. My knees may have protested, but my pride carried me. When I reached the elevator, there she was, Clara. Arms crossed, lips curled in that little smirk that always made me think of a cat who'd gotten into the cream. She glanced at the box, then at me. "I trust you have everything," she said. Her voice dipped in sugar that tasted more like vinegar. I shifted the box against my hip and met her eyes. Really met them. And for just the briefest moment I saw something flicker. Fear? Doubt? Maybe just the realization that I wasn't giving her what she wanted. I smiled, calm and even, and said, "Good luck, Clara." Then I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed and I let out the breath I'd been holding, the box pressing steady against my chest like a shield. Whatever she thought she had won, I knew I had walked out with something she couldn't touch, my dignity. And I had a hunch that tiny crack in her confidence was going to matter more than she ever expected. Driving home that day, with my box of belongings rattling in the passenger seat like a second opinion I hadn't asked for, I couldn't stop thinking about the first time Daniel had brought Clara to meet me. I can still see it clear as day. It was a Sunday evening, and I had gone all out on dinner. Roast chicken, buttery rolls, my famous green bean casserole, because when your only child calls and says, "Mom, I want you to meet someone special," you don't just throw frozen lasagna in the oven. I even dug out the good china, the set with tiny blue flowers around the rim that only comes out when I want to remind people I do, in fact, have taste. Then the door opened, and in came Daniel, practically glowing with pride, and beside him was Clara. Lord, she walked into my house like she'd already been named queen of the place. Tall, polished, perfect hair cascading over her shoulders like she just stepped out of a shampoo commercial. She smiled at me warmly enough, but her eyes, oh, those eyes were scanning everything. My curtains, the rug, the casserole, me. The first words out of her mouth? What a cozy little house. Now, don't get me wrong, I know my place isn't a palace. It's lived in, full of books stacked sideways and knickknacks from flea markets, and my sofa has seen better springs. But when Clara said cozy, she dragged that word out like it was code for *pitiful. The way you describe a friend's haircut when you can't think of anything nice to say. But Daniel was so smitten, practically hanging on her every word, that I brushed it off. I told myself I was being overprotective. He looked at her the way I used to catch him looking at new baseball cards when he was a boy, like he'd found something rare and perfect. And all I wanted was for him to be happy. So I laughed when she fussed over her manicure instead of helping with dishes. I smiled when she asked Daniel to fetch her water as though he was already her butler. I even ignored the way she side-eyed my casserole like it had personally offended her. Pick your battles, I told myself. But little by little Clara started changing Daniel. First it was his clothes. Gone were the comfy sweaters and scuffed loafers. Suddenly he was in tailored suits with ties so sharp they could double as weapons. Then it was his apartment. Out went the leather armchair I'd helped him pick after college. In came sleek furniture that looked more like set dressing than anything a human being could relax on. And then it was the friends. His college buddies stopped showing up to Sunday football, replaced by Clara's crowd of consultants and advisors. People who sipped imported mineral water and called art assets. Before long, I noticed I wasn't being invited as often either. Family dinners became work dinners. Weekend calls became too busy this week. I told myself not to make waves. He was building his life after all, and children grow up. But in my gut, I felt it, the slow erasing of everything familiar, everything that tied Daniel back to who he had been before Clara. And now, sitting there in my car after the disaster of the board meeting, I realized she had done it again. Only this time it wasn't his wardrobe or his friends. She'd erased me from the gallery too, the place I had poured 3 decades of my life into. Clara hadn't just changed Daniel's world. She was stripping me right out of mine. That night, after I had lugged my box of belongings inside and set it down on the kitchen table, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea in my lopsided pottery mug. I was just lowering into my chair when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophie, one of the younger accountants at the gallery. A sweet girl, always offering to carry heavy binders for me, even though she's about as strong as a paperclip. Her text read, Mrs. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. Clara told everyone you were fired for mishandling gallery funds. We had to sign NDAs. I nearly spilled hot tea all over my robe. Mishandling funds? Me? 30 years of balancing books so tightly you could bounce a quarter off them, and she had the gall to tell people I was embezzling? Not only had Clara erased me from the gallery, but now she was painting me as a common thief. My hands shook so badly I had to set my mug down before I cracked the handle. I sat there staring at the message, heart pounding like I just run up a flight of stairs I didn't know existed. Then after a long breath I thought, well, let's just see what game she's playing. I marched to my study, turned on my old desktop, and logged into the gallery system. Truthfully, I half expected my access to be cut off. But there it was, my login still worked, same as always. The screen loaded slower than molasses on a cold morning. But when it finally appeared, I started combing through the financial records. And oh honey, what I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. There were sales, dozens of them, of artworks I had never seen. Supposedly restored, authenticated, and sold under the gallery's name. Paintings listed with artist names that would make a collector salivate. But the dates were wrong, the provenance paperwork was sloppy, and the brushstrokes in the attached photos didn't look right to me. My gut told me what the numbers confirmed. Forgeries. Fake paintings passed off as real, with money flowing in and then flowing right back out again. Tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. And every single transaction bore Daniel's electronic authorization signature. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my tea forgotten and cooling beside me. Either my son, my sweet, earnest Daniel who used to cry when his clay pinch pot collapsed in kindergarten, had somehow gotten himself tangled up in this mess, or someone was forging his name. And I'll tell you the truth. I wanted it to be the second. With every fiber of my being, I prayed it was the second. Because the idea of Daniel being part of something this crooked was worse than losing the gallery, worse than being slandered, worse than standing in that boardroom with everyone watching while Clara tore me down. But as I scrolled through those records, watching the numbers stack higher, watching his name appear again and again beside paintings I knew had never crossed our gallery's threshold, I felt my stomach twist. If it was Clara forging his signature, then she was bold, bolder than I'd ever given her credit for. If it was Daniel, then I didn't know my own son at all. Either way, one thing was suddenly clear to me. This wasn't just a petty firing or a bruised ego anymore. This was something much bigger. And Clara had dragged me right into the middle of it. Not even an hour after I'd discovered the forged sales, I heard the crunch of tires in my driveway and a car door slam like a gavel. My front door swung open so fast it rattled the coat hooks, and there stood Daniel. His tie was hanging crooked, his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it non-stop, and his face was the color of paste. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to slice the quiet right in half. "Clara said you quit. The staff says you were fired. And now I'm getting calls about theft." I didn't even flinch. 30 years in the gallery had taught me how to face a board of trustees who thought their checkbook made them art experts. One upset son wasn't going to rattle me. I picked up the stack of papers I'd printed earlier, records of all those forged paintings and shady transactions, and slid them across the kitchen table. "Then explain these," I said, calm as could be. Daniel snatched up the papers and started scanning. At first his brow furrowed in irritation, like he was ready to argue with me. Then his frown deepened. His lips pressed into a line, his jaw clenched, and slowly, very slowly, his face drained of color. By the time he got to the last page, his shoulders had slumped like a balloon losing air. "This," he stammered, holding up one of the authorization forms with his name scrawled neatly across the bottom. "This isn't my signature. I never approved these sales." I reached across the table, my hand open, palm up, the way I used to when he was a little boy and needed to confess to breaking a lamp. "Sweetheart, she's setting you up." For a moment I thought he'd take my hand, but instead he pulled away, pushing back his chair so hard it squeaked against the linoleum. He started pacing across my kitchen, back and forth like a caged lion. "There has to be another explanation," he said, running his fingers through his hair again. She wouldn't do this." His voice cracked on the last word, as if even saying it out loud was too heavy to carry. I watched him, my heart aching, but I didn't argue. You can't argue someone out of love, no matter how much evidence you pile in front of them. Love isn't logical, it's sticky. It clings even when it's cracked. He stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, his head hanging low. I could see the war playing out inside him. On one side, the Clara he thought he knew, brilliant, sophisticated, his partner in both life and business. On the other side, the mountain of evidence sitting on my kitchen table. Proof that someone was robbing him blind and dragging his good name through the mud. "Mom," he finally said, his voice quiet and uneven, "you must be mistaken. Maybe it's an error in the system, or maybe..." He trailed off, not even believing his own excuses. I didn't push him. I just folded my hands and waited. I could already see the cracks forming in his faith. And once a crack appears, no matter how much you try to ignore it, it only widens. He was going to see the truth eventually. The only question was whether he'd admit it before Clara took everything. Daniel sat down heavily at my kitchen table. The stack of forged records still spread between us like an unwelcome guest. His face was pale, but his eyes had taken on that restless, darting look I remembered from when he was a boy and had something to confess. "Mom," he said finally, his voice rough, "there's something I need to tell you." Now, when your grown child starts with that, you brace yourself. I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms, waiting. "I hired a private investigator 6 months ago." I blinked. That was not what I expected. "You what?" He rubbed his temples. I started noticing little things. Stories that didn't quite match. Phone calls she took in another room. Receipts that didn't line up with where she said she'd been. At first I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I stared at him, torn between relief that my son's instincts weren't completely dead and frustration that he hadn't told me sooner. "And you didn't think to mention this to your mother?" He gave me a sheepish look, the same one he used when he was 8 and tried to hide that he'd broken a vase by gluing the pieces back together crooked. "I didn't want you to think I was doubting her. Or worse, that I was becoming you." I rolled my eyes. Becoming me wouldn't have been the worst thing, Daniel. He slid a folder across the table. The investigator gave me this last week. I haven't had the courage to read it all until now. Well, I opened that thing like I was unwrapping a casserole dish at a potluck. And what I found inside nearly knocked the wind out of me. Clara wasn't Clara at all. Her real name was Claire Monroe. She had been running variations of this con for years in different cities, different galleries, different men. A trail of charm, forged credentials, and broken partnerships stretched out behind her like breadcrumbs no one had wanted to follow. And the illness she claimed to have early in her relationship with Daniel? The one that made him feel guilty enough to propose because life is too short? Complete fiction. There were no medical records, no prescriptions, no doctor visits, just well-timed theatrics. It got worse. Much worse. Claire wasn't even living her life fully with Daniel. She had another man, a so-called consultant named Ryan Hale. The investigator had photos of them laughing together outside a downtown condo she'd purchased. And yes, she'd bought that condo with gallery funds. I recognized the siphoned amounts in the report. I flipped through those photographs slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. Claire with Ryan at dinner. Claire and Ryan carrying shopping bags from expensive boutiques. Claire leaning into him, looking genuinely happy in a way I realized I had never seen her look at my son. I put the photos down carefully, my hands trembling. Daniel, she's been living a double life. With him. Using your money, our gallery's money, to fund it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his face ashen, staring at nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. So my marriage, my future, all of it. Yes, sweetheart, I said softly, laying a hand on his arm. All of it built on lies. And for once he didn't pull away. He just let the truth sink in, heavy as a stone. The very next morning, Daniel showed up at my house looking like he hadn't rested a wink, though he was holding himself together with that stiff, determined posture I'd seen only a handful of times in his life. He had the investigator's folder under one arm and his car keys in the other. We're going to the gallery, he said. I didn't argue. I grabbed my coat, slipped the old master key into my pocket. Yes, the same one Clara probably assumed I had turned in ages ago. And off we went. The building was quiet when we arrived, the kind of hush that only happens before the staff trickle in with their coffees. The echo of our shoes in the hallway was almost too loud, like the place itself knew something was about to happen. I unlocked Clara's office door with the satisfying click of a key that still knew its place. Inside, everything was perfectly arranged as usual. Her desk was spotless, not a paper out of line, pens aligned like little soldiers. It was the sort of space that looked organized until you peeked beneath the surface. And oh, did we peek. Daniel went straight for her computer while I rifled through her file drawers. It didn't take long. Tucked under legitimate documents were printouts of emails between Clara and Ryan, written with the breezy confidence of two people who thought they'd already won. Plans, jokes, even timelines. There were also provenance papers for several pieces we both knew were fakes, each stamped and signed as though they'd passed through legitimate hands. And then there was the kicker. Drafts of statements meant to frame Daniel as the mastermind. My son, painted as a greedy gallery director skimming from his own institution. It made my stomach turn. At precisely 8:15, we heard the sharp rhythm of high heels in the hallway. Daniel and I locked eyes, each of us taking a deep breath. Then the door opened. Clara froze when she saw us sitting there, papers spread across her pristine desk like dirty laundry on display. For a split second, the mask slipped and her eyes went wide. But just as quickly, she recovered, stepping into the room with a smile smooth enough to sell toothpaste. Daniel, she cooed. What a surprise. And Evelyn, I thought your access was revoked. Daniel didn't waste time. He slid the emails across the desk. Care to explain this? Her eyes flickered down at the papers, and for a heartbeat her face hardened. But then she plastered on that sweet smile again. These are fabricated. Honestly, Daniel, you've always been too trusting, too naive. You let people plant doubts in your head, and now look at you chasing ghosts. Without a word, Daniel pulled a photo from the investigator's folder, one of her and Ryan arm in arm outside the condo. He laid it gently on top of the emails. And this? Is this a ghost too? The sweetness drained right out of her. Her lips thinned, her eyes narrowed, and finally she dropped the act. Fine, she spat. Yes, I've been seeing someone. But you too? You're pathetic. This gallery was dying until I came along. I did what had to be done. She turned on me then, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. And you, Evelyn, you never accepted me. You were jealous from the very first day. I leaned forward, hands folded neatly in my lap, and gave her a smile that came from years of experience outlasting storms. No, Clara. I gave you every chance. You used every single one of them to hurt my son. Her jaw clenched, and with a sharp motion she grabbed her purse from the chair. You'll never prove anything, she sneered, tossing the words over her shoulder as she strutted to the door. And with one last cruel smirk, she clicked down the hallway, her heels echoing like a challenge. Daniel sat heavily in her chair, staring at the mess of evidence on the desk. I rested my hand on his shoulder. For the first time, he didn't resist it. 6 months later, I was sitting at my desk with the morning paper spread out beside my tea when the news broke. Clara, though by then everyone knew her real name, Claire Monroe, had been arrested by federal art crime investigators. I nearly dropped my cup when I saw her photo plastered right there in black and white. But oh, what a moment that was. She wasn't standing in designer heels anymore. No, ma'am. She was in plain clothes, hair a little limp, walking between two officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. It turned out she'd been running this scam for years, across at least 5 different states. Different names, different galleries, always the same pattern. Worm her way in, stir up trouble, drain the accounts, vanish before anyone figured it out. By the time investigators were finished, the total losses from her schemes added up to millions. I don't usually say I told you so, but let me just say I brewed myself an extra strong cup of chamomile that morning and toasted my bonsai tree like we'd both earned a medal. The gallery survived, though it wasn't exactly a graceful process. For months, Daniel and I were knee-deep in paperwork, audits, and interviews with officials who seemed allergic to plain English. We had staff to reassure, patrons to soothe, and more than one donor to beg forgiveness from. At one point, I joked to Daniel that maybe I should just hang a sign out front. Asterisk, yes, we're still open, and no, we didn't steal your money. Asterisk, he didn't laugh at first, but eventually even he saw the humor in it. Through all the mess, something good happened. Daniel and I started working side by side again, just like when he was a boy tagging along at the gallery, asking me 100 questions about why paint cracked or how to tell the difference between walnut and oak frames. We rebuilt together not just the gallery but our trust in each other. And then when the dust finally began to settle, he met someone new. Laura, a schoolteacher, quiet and gentle in her ways, with a smile that actually reached her eyes. I'll never forget the first time I heard him laugh with her. It was light, unguarded, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard in years. The kind that said, asterisk, this is easy, this is real. Asterisk, I liked her immediately, not because she tried to impress me, but because she didn't. She came over one Sunday with a casserole dish in hand and an apron still tied around her waist. Sorry, it's not fancy, she said. I nearly hugged her right then. As for me, I sit now in my restored office, everything right where it belongs again. The bonsai is still hanging on, stubborn little thing, probably out of spite, which makes it my spirit plant. My chipped ceramic cup holds tea every morning, and I sip it slowly while the sunlight hits the window just right. Sometimes I wonder how I didn't see all the warning signs with Clara sooner, but then I remind myself, I did see them. I just chose to ignore them, hoping my son's happiness was worth the gamble. In the end, Clara thought she could erase me, but all she did was expose herself. And let me tell you, the sight of her walking into that courtroom in handcuffs, shoulders slumped and mask shattered, that was the sweetest revenge I could have asked for. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, undeniable justice. It was in its own way a masterpiece.
Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever trusted your gut about someone and later been proven right? If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.